Hey everyone, Bobos here, coming at you with another video, and this time it's something a little bit different. Instead of a build demonstration or a build guide, this is going to be a discussion video about life versus CI. And before we begin, I know that this topic has already received quite a lot of scrutiny by some popular players in the community, such as Pox, and I don't want to just make a video reiterating everything they said, so there will be some different content in here. I basically made a brief little list of things I want to talk about, and the main thing I want to talk about is the arguments that people make for why life is fine and in a good place, because that's kind of like been the backlash to things that like people like Pox have been saying and Ziz have been saying. So there's been people who have been like arguing back on Reddit and stuff. I think one of the specific examples that really brought this to light was the Shinra guy, I think his name is. He's like a boss killer in hardcore. He did New Bird Theory Run where he was hit by a storm call and chunked out super hard. I think it was like 18 or 19 KS, and that got damage to him. So he only had like a couple hundred left or something. And that video ignited a ton of discussion, obviously. And there were people in the thread that were making a ton of arguments for why life is actually in a good position and shouldn't be changed and stuff like that. So that's mainly what I'm going to deal with. But initially, I do want to just go over the basic arguments for pretty much why the general consensus is that CI is much better than life, right? So the first thing is I want to reiterate the two major points, or what I find to be the two major points, which is CI has much more effective health. And I think this is pretty self-explanatory because you can get a ton of energy shield nodes from the tree, and they're all very efficient for the most part. And not only that, but the gear that you equip just has a much higher base ES value, right? So you can just get a ton of base ES from like your chest, your helm, your boots. If you use a shield, you can get a ton, and then you can get a ton of ES percent from the tree, and then on top of that, you can get a ton of int, which scales your ES even more. So it's just very easy to get an insane amount of energy shield, and it's mostly from the base ES on the pieces that you equip. And then the second major point is that CI requires either less point investment or less gear investment, allowing for more damage/utility. So stemming from the first point, if you only need like 10k ES or something, right, then you have a couple options. You can either skimp on nodes in the tree and equip a lot more gear with base energy shield on it, right? So you use like less uniques, you could say, or something like that in your build, because maybe your build doesn't need to use certain uniques, right? So you just use higher energy shields, higher base energy shield pieces, and you can get more damage or utility from the tree. Now, if your build needs to use a ton of uniques, you can, or needs to be like dual wield or something like that, or a staff, then you can get energy shield from other places. You can either stack in like Hawa and Whispering Ice, or you can just get a ton of percent ES from the tree, and you're gonna have still a reasonably good ES value because while you don't have the flat ES from the gear, you have a ton of ES from the tree. So it gives you that flexibility that you can kind of go either way, and it lets you use a lot more unique items and stuff like that. And then, so those are the two main points. And then I also wanted to refute the common misconceptions about CI. This has been done before as well, but it's worth mentioning in this video. So the first one is that CI is much more vulnerable to status ailments and stuns. Well, you basically have a ton of ways in this game to get stun immune, especially if you go low life. You can use Chula, Presence of Chula. There's boots that give stun immunity. Skin of the Loyals now have Whispering Stance, or Unwavering Stance rather. You can actually take Unwavering Stance on some builds. So there's tons of ways to get stun immunity. You can even get the boot enchant, which is really good if you're not essentially doing bosses where you're trying to face tank them, right? 80% chance to avoid being stunned is huge because CI has an implicit 50% chance to avoid stuns, and those don't stack. But it's still, you're not going to be running into many situations where you're really going to die to stun, having a huge health pool when you have 80% reduced stun on your boots, right? At least in terms of general mapping. So there's just tons of ways to get stun immunity. As far as the status ailments, there's ways to get status ailment immunity, like Raider is very popular. But often cases, status ailments aren't the end-all be-all when you have a huge chunk of health, right? And on top of that, what's going to hit you really hard to put on those status ailments will most likely also cause those status ailments to life, unless your build is set up or constructed in a very specific way, or unless you're running like in excess of 8k life or something like that. So life builds basically share a lot of the problems in dealing with status ailments as CI builds. So it's not like they have a significant advantage in most cases, which kind of makes that argument that, oh, like, CI just gets stunned and frozen all the time and stuff like that. When you practically play the game, especially if you have a high clear speed build that, your offense is your defense essentially, and then you have like a huge chunk of health for your defense as well, then that's not really the case in a lot of the times. And not to mention, you can mitigate this by using like utility flasks and stuff as well. So like a freeze immune flask, a bleed immune flask, stuff like that. You can have stuff that takes ignite off, remove shock. So all these things can be remedied via flasks, and you're going to be using 5 utility flasks anyway as CI. So, and then the other point that's a misconception about CI is that it's squishier than life. Barring the difference in health total, right? So they're basically talking about effective HP because they're saying, yeah, you have a ton more energy shield, but it's actually, you're taking more chunks out of it than a life build would get chunked out because you don't have any form of alternative defense, right? And this is the case for some life builds, right? Like a lot of bow builds that go life will use acrobatics and then phase acrobatics. They have a lot of dodge and they have a lot of evasion on top of that. And those builds can be fine, but most cases you're not getting a ton of life to go with that, right? So you're sacrificing the huge HP pool to get more alternative defense, and in most cases that alternative defense is not going to make up for the sizable gap in HP, right? But in other builds, you're not even really getting that defense, right? Because a lot of defense in this game now comes not from stacking things like evasion or armor, but it comes from your flasks. So it used to be Rumi's was an insane flask. Now it's still a pretty good flask. You have things like Basalt Flask. You have things like Taste of Hate. So you have a lot of ways to get like alternative mitigation through flask, especially with flask effectiveness nodes. And that's a way that most people are building their characters to survive the content, right? So it's not about stacking a ton of armor, right? That would be hard for a CI build to do, or anything, or stacking a ton of evasion or something like that. So you don't, in most cases, you really don't have many more defensive layers that are going to boost your effective HP up enough to be equivalent with CI. So now that those things are talked about, the last part that I really want to go over is like refuting arguments for why life is fine, right? And there's a couple of these. So the first one that I encounter sometimes is that life is cheaper. I don't think this is a very good argument at all, because it doesn't, like, the fact that life is cheaper is really just a symptom of the fact that CI is better, right? So if life was better, life gear would be more expensive because it's more in demand. Now, it is harder to roll ES on some pieces, right? Because you need more rolls to make it complete. But it's also easier to have ES on some pieces, I think, like rings, for example. You can actually craft the best ES roll on there, whereas with life, you pretty much need to hit a very high life roll, either like you're chaosing a ring or you're essencing it or something like that if you're trying to make a life version, because otherwise you're out a huge life roll. So the fact that life is cheaper, it doesn't really, it's not like a good argument, right, at all, because it doesn't say anything about which one's better. Life might be cheaper, sure, but CI is still better. And then the second point I wanted to go over is basically the main one that I wanted to focus this video on. So this is that life can do all the content in the game, right? And that's the argument I always hear people say. They're always like, oh, well, yeah, CI, this, that, but life can do everything in the game, so there's no problem. And this is just kind of like, it's a weird argument for me, right? Because it really, like, in some sense, you could grant them that point, but it really just depends on how you're trying to define better, right? When you're talking about CI being better than life. Or like what the intentions of the game mechanics were, and that's like the approach that I'm going to come at it from. So how I look at this is I'm going to make an assumption, right? And this assumption is that the goal of having two different forms of health essentially in this game is so that in some circumstances one of those forms of health will be better, and then in other circumstances the other will be better, right? Because if you're just going to have them be the same, then there's no point in having two different types of health. And then if you're going to have one of them be better virtually all the time, then there's almost no point in having the other one. So you want there to be like a rough balance. Like you're never going to get 50-50, but I assume that the intent is to, have a reasonable amount of scenarios where life would be favorable and a reasonable amount of scenarios where CI would be favorable. And I think at the start of the game, like the beta, this was more so the case in a way because we just had less powerful utility flasks and there was just less utility overall. So things like the builds being squishier and being more vulnerable to status ailments, those were like legitimate cons back then. Whereas now they're shored up by a lot of flasks or maybe unique items or stuff like that. So the game has just changed a lot basically. But anyways, getting back on topic, so because you want a difference, right? And like, oh, this life can handle these scenarios, CI can handle these scenarios. What we're seeing is that almost every build can be built better CI, right? Whether it's Ranger or like, I don't know, Essence Drain or Totem builds are better CI. Like, pretty much everything you can play is just better as CI. Spectral Throws better as CI. There's very few things that life really has in its domain where you can comfortably say, okay, this is the best version of this build you can make and it's life-based, right? And I think that's a big problem because you shouldn't want the goal is almost that the way the game is looking at now, and this kind of goes back to the life is cheaper thing, is that like, oh, life is like your starter, right? And then you convert to CI. CI is like the end game and life is like the starter. So life isn't really being seen as like a viable alternative to CI. It's the stepping stone to get to CI and to allow your build to survive before you eventually get to your god mode, which is CI, which is tons of energy shield and stuff like that. So that's the way I'm looking at it. It's basically just that there's two different roles in the game, and CI is filling all those roles. Like a little story about my own experience. So if you've watched anything on this channel, I've been messing around with a freeze pulse build, and the idea was to just do something cheap because I didn't really know how it would play in maps. I simmed it, and the damage was good, but I just wasn't sure if I really wanted to play it. So I was like, yeah, I'll mess around with like one of the Covenant, I think it was, this new chest, and I'll go life and like blood magic and stuff, or the skill would be blood magic, and I'll have some fun and see how I like it. So I make the build, and it's actually Marauder because I don't like the Blasphemy Curse on Hit, especially with Freezing Pulse, kind of due to the range on Freezing Pulse and how bad Blasphemy got nerfed and stuff. So you can't have the Warlord's Mark like super far out there anymore, so that's why I went Marauder anyways, and initially I was like, oh, Marauder, if I'm going to go Marauder anyway, I probably want to build this life, and I'll throw the ES on the mana, and I'll just do like a Moam thing like that, right? And it worked fine, but then I theory crafted like a couple weeks later a CI build, and the CI build is just going to be unequivocally better in every way. And this is starting Marauder, which is kind of insane because Marauder is supposed to be that spot in the tree where because you're going to have to waste so many points, essentially, going CI, that this would be the point where if anything is going to start Marauder, right, you'd think, oh, it should probably be life, right? And even in this circumstance, CI is better. I have more effective health. I'm immune to chaos damage. All my health pool is in one place, and I get around 300k more damage just from the. It's kind of insane. Not all of that is purely because I went CI, but a fair chunk of it is because I could get just more damage nodes from the tree, right? And I can use items that I wouldn't be able to use as life. So when you consider that, yeah, a lot of it actually is the fact that I was able to go CI. Stuff like Skin of the Loyal, like really amazing, right? because it gives a +1, which is really good for stuff like Empower, which wouldn't really have been as worth it to run in other setups. So CI is just, it's even stronger for builds that like start in the life side of the tree, which is kind of mind-boggling. You can do stuff like Whispering Ice as Marauder. Whispering Ice is even easier because you just need to convert the strength that you go through at the top of Marauder to int. Something like this, you actually get less benefit from doing something like that, but the build is still better. So I think that's kind of really the crux, right, of the issue, is that if you can do that and have CI still be better, then there's probably a bit of a balancing issue, right? And then another thing people will say is that in this kind of, well, actually, I'll go over this one first. So it's a point that gets brought up in tandem sometimes with the life can do all the content in the game. So they say that most endgame content contains one-shot mechanics, and they're arguing about stuff like the Atzuri Stormcrawl, right? And they're saying that, yeah, Shinra's build or whatever is just an anomaly, and if you get hit by those Stormcrawls, you'll die as any build. Now, I'll gladly grant that his build is an anomaly having that much ES, right? Even though if you're going to build a character to farm Uber Atzuri, getting a ton of ES is not bad for a plethora of other reasons, right? But I'll grant that. Fine, that's an anomaly. Atzuri Stormcrawls are not the only thing that are gonna in the game, right? That your character's gonna be damaged by. Like, first of all, this argument doesn't even account for actual mapping, right? It's only a bossing argument because in a map scenario, it's very rare that you're gonna be one shot by one thing, especially with the shape map system, because now we're talking about fighting bosses, which are relatively benign. So even when you give them mods, they're not gonna be able to hit insane damage. And I guess unless you're shaping like a mud geyser and you give the devourer like 3 added as elementals or something like that. But in most cases, you're not getting one shot just running through random maps. It's a combination of little hits that's gonna, or big hits and little hits that's gonna take out your character, right? And having more effective health is going to help that, especially, and we're not talking about a little bit more effective health here. We're talking about, in some cases, like double the effective health, right? And having double the effective health is definitely going to save your character tons of times over while mapping, especially if you use logout, because you can just log out a lot quicker, right? Or you can log out, you're going to get chunked, and then you have the ability to log out. Whereas as life, you're just going to get one shot or something like that. So yeah, that argument I don't understand in that. Well, that's one problem with it, right? Is that it only applies to bossing. But then even in the domain of bossing, it's still kind of like a bad argument, right? Because a lot of the one-shot mechanics that you see from these Guardians and Shaper and stuff are fairly telegraphed stuff, and they're easy to avoid, right? So if you know the mechanics of the fight, you're not going to be dying to Phoenix's charge up thing or something like that. So that means that you're going to be more likely to be killed by other things during the fight. Like Hydra is a great example, right? Like you can't tell me that having like 14k ES on Hydra is like the same feeling as having like 6 or 7k life on Hydra, right? It's just nowhere near the same. Like you can get chunked really hard in Hydra by getting hit with multiple things and log out with CI, that you would just get vaporized as life. So that argument is pretty ridiculous, I'd say, even against the Guardians. And I think a really good example of this is, I think it was like last league, Ziz was farming Shaper. He was doing a War Chief Totem, which is a great build to farm Shaper because it's so cheap anyways, so even if you die, no big deal. So I'm not criticizing his build or his build choice, but he was playing the life build, right? And I think he got killed by he got one hit by the Shaper clone, if I remember correctly. And then he was farming with his Essence Strain character and he got hit by the clone and didn't die because obviously he had like, I think like 14, 15k ES at the time, possibly more. So it, to say that all these boss fights just revolve around one shots is, it's kind of like just self-serving for your own argument, right? Like you're really just like cherry picking specific examples that are going to benefit your argument and then acting as if those are the only relevant dangers of the fight. When in reality, those are probably some of the least relevant dangers. Maybe in Shaper you can make an exception, but in a fight like Phoenix or something, like definitely the charge up is not like a huge danger, right? So because it's so telegraphed and you know it's coming. Maybe if you do it with like incredible increased AoE or something, but barring that. So yeah, so that's an argument that I don't really not really a fan of that argument either. And then the last one I want to touch upon is like the thing people always say, oh, my build is better as life. And what does this mean? Well, it's like normally they're talking about they have a specific build that essentially can only be done as life, or it only work as life. Maybe it works off of strength, or it's a blood magic build, so obviously that can't be a CI, and you're not going to do it low life. So there are some builds in the game that obviously are better as life. Uh, but something, a caveat to that too, is that a lot of times they're only better as life because they like literally can't be built CI, right? Like it's not as if like going life is affording them better things, right? It's more just that in a lot of cases, like the actual mechanics of the build, like in the case of something like a blood magic build, you cannot actually build. Like if the build really needs blood magic for some reason, or if it's like really strong with blood magic because like the mana cost of the skill would be insane otherwise, or something like that, then the build can only be built as blood magic, right? Uh, but if you could somehow build that build and make it energy shield, you'd probably just end up with a lot more effective health. So even in the cases where a build can't be built CI, it's mostly because of like a mechanical problem with constructing the build, or a limitation rather. It's not really something like, oh, like I would want to go life in this circumstance. There are a couple cases of that, but you know, what is it, like 3 to 5 builds tops or something like that? Maybe a little bit more out of the meta builds. So yeah, that's pretty much everything, and yeah, I think that's it. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope I was able to respond to some of those arguments and pretty much give you at least a little bit of a different perspective than some of the other videos that have been made about this, because a lot of people are making really great content, and I didn't just want to rehash everything, so I wanted to have at least a couple unique, hopefully salient points there. So anyways, thank you very much for watching, and if you like the content, feel free to subscribe, and see you guys next time.